Robert, for joining me on my podcast today. So, can you just start off, give a little bit of brief explanation, summary, who you are, what you do, how you got there, just like a little brief summary?
Sure. So my name is Robert Price. I am currently the Chief Technology Officer of a Series A biotech startup called CleanJoule. CleanJoule focuses on producing energetics and propellants. So that is things that go boom and things that make stuff go. So we're in the moving items business, but particularly dealing with chemistry and hydrocarbons, biology, and how all of that intersects to make us fuels without having to rely on the traditional supply chains that petrochem does. Right, the gasoline that's in the tank in your car might have come from Russia, it might have come from Saudi Arabia, it might have come from Texas. It's hard to say because of the globalized nature of the petrochemical industry, but bringing domestic manufacturing, sustainability to energetics and propellants.
Perfect. So, before we get into all of that, can we first just talk about your childhood and what kind of environment you grew up in, just so I can get a little feel and background?
Sure. So originally I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. My parents, one of them was a he had a so my dad had a degree in aerospace engineering, but he only really got that so that he could be a fighter pilot. So he was a fighter pilot in the Air Force and then went on to commercial aviation. So got my kind of background in aviation for aviation fuels there, as well as DoD. And then my mother has degrees in math and computer science. So it's a fairly technical crowd. I grew up in a pretty standard house for like the late 80s, early 90s America. It was probably like 2,000, 2,500 square feet, kind of in the suburbs. And, you always got sent to school with what you learned. And my parents were fairly strict, I would say, but part of that probably comes from military background, right? I think most people that have military parents, the military parents bring some of that military with them when they are teaching you and showing you and disciplining you and all of that. So I grew up there for most of my young childhood, and then after that, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, actually a suburb called Marietta. Um, did scouting, so I'm an Eagle Scout, and also as part of that, a number of the parents in our scout troop were actually engineers for Lockheed Martin. So Lockheed Martin is a large defense contractor, right? They make the F-22.
That's my favorite fighter jet.
Yeah, so planes. I walked the production line for the F-22 when I was like 11 or 12 because we had probably 7 or 8 different parents that worked at Lockheed. And that site, the Marietta Dobbins Air Force Base site, is the place that they put together all the F-22s.
So, have you seen the F-35 or any of those production lines, or?
No, I haven't seen those production lines. Even when we walked the F-22 lines at the time, and keep in mind this was pre 2001, right? So pre 9/11, country didn't have near the focus on like terrorism and espionage and all of that, right? The Soviet Union just fell in 91, so you just lost your major competitor. So it was a lot more lax then. They weren't as hard up on keeping secret things secret. So I don't even know if it would be possible to get as close as we did then to an F-35 line. But basically, they had airframes moving down a very large hangar for assembly, each one surrounded by barbed wire fencing so that you can't get within, 40, 50 feet of it. But you can walk down the line and see the progress and see the guys working on it. I always remember a guy inside the engine intake, the on the front of the F-22 with a 2x4, just bang, bang, beating something back into shape in in the engine intake with the oldest tool man has ever had, right? A stick. We're just gonna beat it with a stick until it's back into shape. So that was always an interesting juxtaposition.
So I think it's really interesting because you have very STEM oriented parents. So did that influence you into doing things related to math and sciences and STEM, or was it purely your own interest?
I don't think we were ever told that you have to do STEM, but certainly there was never a question of are you going to college? The question was what are you going to college for? So there was never really an option given to us. And us, I have a brother as well. So my brother's 3 years older than me. He's a mechanical engineer with an MBA. So again, staying in the engineering technical crowd type arena. I don't know that we were ever told we had to do STEM, but both my parents were STEM, and a lot of the influence that we saw around us, right, it was engineering and all this stuff. My dad had friends that flew everything in the Air Force from first gen stealth, like F-117 Nighthawks, to cargo transports to other fighter pilots. And the thing about flying for the military, at least then, I'm not sure if it's still the best way now, but you have to have a STEM degree. So you cannot be a fighter pilot without a STEM degree. If you have a degree in English, tough luck. If you have no degree, tough luck. You have to have a STEM education in order to be a pilot in the DoD, at least the Air Force at that time. Again, I don't know right now. So almost all of my parents' friends were STEM as well. There just wasn't that much exposure to things that were not STEM, if that makes sense. It wasn't necessarily a requirement put on us, but I don't know how much there really was another option. It just was never presented. Nobody was like, hey, you could be an artist, right? And no, that was never an option. Nobody ever said that. Nothing ever happened. Everybody that we knew, was technical in some regard.
So what plans did you end up making for college? Like what plans, where did you want to go? Did you want to stay close to home? Did you want to have a degree that followed more of your mom or your dad?
My college journey is probably even weirder of a story. When I was in high school, I started taking college classes after school in the summer of my freshman year of high school. So my parents didn't really want me to come home yet. Keep your kids out the house. This is the olden days, right? You could just go and do whatever. So after high school was over, and it was over at whatever 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I would go up the hill and take college classes. So at the same time that I was learning geometry, I was doing calculus 1. And at the same time we were doing trig, I was doing calculus 2. So you can do like geometry, algebra, trig, and calculus all in parallel because you actually don't need them for each other. It's only once you get into linear algebra, ordinary differential equations, and partial differential equations where you start combining uh, algebra and calculus. So you can get through Calc 1, 2, and 3 with basically just a basic knowledge of pre-algebra. So I did that all at the same time. I started taking pharmacology classes because I thought that was interesting. And then I actually dropped out of high school my junior year. So I still don't have a high school diploma. It is just my bachelor's and my PhD. So after I'd been taking classes for some time, and by this time I was in Utah, so I was walking up the hill to the University of Utah taking classes. And then in my junior year, the University of Utah had a program. I don't know if they still do, but at the time they had a office called the Office of High School Recruitment. And the goal of the Office of High School Recruitment is to try and keep high performing students in the state that would normally go out of state.
But this is after you dropped out.
No, so this is how I dropped out. So my junior year, the Office of High School Recruitment says basically, hey, your GPA and your test scores are great. We see you have all this college credit already. why don't you just come up to the U and forget about your last year of high school? And by the way, we'll give you a scholarship to do it. And I was like, cool, let's do that. So I dropped out after my junior year and went to college. And then, um, so in college, I was able to do that one faster as well because I had taken a number of classes ahead of time. So I was actually ahead on the core curriculum for a chemistry degree by a year. So I stuck with chemistry and then finished the bachelor's in 3 years also. But it's only like these weird things. Like none of it's planned. I didn't plan that I'm gonna try and get this done quick and like I'm not gonna do my senior year or any of that stuff. It wasn't really so much planning as just it happened and I was there to grab the opportunity when it presented itself.
So did you end up going and staying in Utah then if you wanted to like enhance your degree, go for masters, and then when you went for your PhD?
So traditionally it's frowned upon to do your bachelor's degree and a graduate degree at the same institution. Why that is, I don't know. I could guess. You want to have a number of different experiences, right? It could be exposed to different ways of people doing things. Even when you get into science and engineering, yes, there are best principles and there are best ways to do things, but there's a lot of wiggle room around all of that. So, how one organization does something and how another organization does something can be totally different, but both completely correct. And so it's really to try and give you exposure to other stuff, but I didn't really want to do that. So I just stayed at the same institution. And then that's another kind of weird story is so by serendipity I skipped my senior year of high school and just went to college. And then essentially by serendipity I found my graduate advisors lab also. So I was an undergraduate doing science courses and all of that, and I happened upon um, through a family connection actually someone who was working on their PhD in bioengineering. And graduate labs a lot of times take undergraduates as like volunteer people. Generally, if you're doing undergraduate research, you're not really paid unless there's a scholarship. Like at the U of U, there's something called UROP, which is the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. So they pay for you to spend a summer in a lab to work, get experience, kind of like an internship. But if it's not part of one of those programs, traditionally you wouldn't be paid. So I was working a job to pay my bills, and then I was going to this lab after that to volunteer, and then I was doing college also at the same time. So I started that the second year. I mean, the junior, sophomore, senior stuff doesn't really work when you only did it in 3 years, but my second year I started working in that lab. And then as I was about to graduate, my PI, who's my principal investigator, right, the PhD that's over the whole graduate lab, he says, you know what, why don't you just stay here for grad school? You can apply here, keep working in my lab. I'd already been working for a year and a half. I was getting close to my first publication as an undergraduate, and then I could just kind of roll that in to my graduate work and keep going. So I thought, seems like a reasonable idea. So I just stayed. And then so I went from the Department of Chemistry to the Department of Pharmacy. So my PhD is actually in pharmaceutical chemistry. And there's generally like three branches of pharmacy. There's med chem, medicinal chemistry, there's pharmacology, toxicology, and then there's pharmaceutical chemistry. And then you have PharmD, which is completely separate, right? PharmD is like your retail pharmacist at Walgreens or CVS or whatever. The people that actually dispense the drugs, that's a PharmD, which is not a PhD. It's a different degree. Like a JD is for lawyers or an MD is for doctors. Well, a PharmD is a pharmacist's doctorate degree. But medchem, medicinal chemistry is basically how do the structures that we make interact with the body and move around. Pharmacology, toxicology. Pharmacology is how do drugs move around, how are they metabolized, how are they secreted. Toxicology is how does it affect your body? Is it dangerous? Is it toxic? What happens? And then pharmaceutical chemistry is essentially everything that goes into a drug besides the actual drug. So if you take a tablet of Tylenol, just go to the grocery store, you've got a headache, and you get a tablet that has acetaminophen in it. The acetaminophen is only one part of that tablet. So they're going to have a number of other things in that tablet. They might have coatings to protect it from the acid in your stomach. They might have excipients, which is just a fancy word for other stuff that goes in the drug tablet that helps it dissolve when it gets to your intestine or helps it absorb in your body better or stabilizes it while it's on the shelf. So, pharmaceutical chemistry is a study of basically everything else except for what you would call an API, which is an active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is the actual drug itself. So within an acetaminophen tablet that you take for a headache, there could be 10, 12, 15, 20 different compounds that are in there that all do different things. So that's what pharmaceutical chemistry is. That's what my actual PhD is in. Now, the funny thing about doing a PhD is I never did any pharmaceutical chemistry. I had to learn about it as part of the coursework and do labs on it, and tangentially I was related with it. But I and my graduate lab did all molecular biology, synthetic biology, genetic engineering as a way to make drugs for oncology. So I was working on actual APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and we were working on the production of those from biology, which is what leads me into what I do today. But at the time in college, and I guess really long-winded answer to your question of did I stay at the same place or for grad school and all of that? Yeah, I stayed at the same institution, generally frowned upon. I thought it was fine, seemed to be doing okay now, so I just stayed.
Okay. So that's really interesting. We can talk more about that as we keep going. But I just want to now talk about what you currently do, and if because I know you've talked about how you kind of stretched past what your PhD was. So let's just kind of can you just give a little bit about like going deeper into what you actually do now, and if you find yourself using any parts of your PhD or other parts of your degree.
Yeah, so what I do now, I'm the chief technology officer of a company that makes essentially biofuels, let's say. But what we do is we make biofuels that are what you would call performance advantaged. So what that means is that they're better than what they're replacing. Traditionally in biomanufacturing or trying to find green solutions or whatever, you have to there's give and take, right? The give is that it's green and the take is it's usually not as good, right? So, refrigerants is a great example. Chlorofluorocarbons are amazing refrigerants. Now, they punch holes in the atmosphere like you would not believe and make ozone holes, right? There's a reason CFCs are banned now. But they went to more reasonable molecules. They don't work quite as well. So in our case, the whole goal is to be able to make a molecule that you're not going to destroy the planet with necessarily, but is also not worse. You don't have to make any hard decisions of whether you want performance or for the molecule to work in the application. Basically, what I'm offering is a molecule that works better in the application for the same amount of money, but it's also domestically produced and green and all of that. So the biofuels in and of itself, essentially how I got here is I worked at another company. I've worked at several companies since the end of my PhD, right? My PhD ended in about 2014, so it's been about 11 years since the end of my terminal degree. I worked in a number of small companies. One of them was called Technology Holding. Tech Holding is what this current company, CleanJoule, spun out of. And the technology that we use in this company, I started developing in 2014 at Technology Holding. So THL did essentially anything that someone was willing to pay for. So it could be making polymers or chemicals or drugs or fuels or testing. We've done medical devices, anything you can really think of that somehow we had expertise in, or at least tangentially related expertise, and someone's willing to pay for, we did. So we got a lot of broad experience in making all different kinds of molecules and compounds using biology. And this one that we spun out into CleanJoule is the second time that we've done it. So prior, we did another company called Biocosm. Biocosm did a combination drug device auto injector. Not a super interesting story. Took a seed round, it exited, and then we kept working to get the next one. And then CleanJoule was the next one. So we're working on the second one now, but essentially the underlying science behind CleanJoule or making a cancer drug from bacteria is identical. So you do genetic engineering, you have to figure out the bioprocess engineering, you have to figure out separations. So the downstream chemistry, how do you get the material you want out of all the other junk that you don't want. And then at the end of it, you go into something different, right? If it's a drug, then I go into like full scale drug testing, an in vitro panel you have to do, in vivo panels, human trials, all this stuff. Versus for fuels, we have to go through ASTM clearinghouse process that allows you to certify fuels to be used in commercial aviation. We have to go through DoD mil specking that allows the DoD to acquire fuels through the DLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, so that they can actually buy this material and use it for things. So there's different, essentially it splits right after you make the material, that either you need to know a lot more about fuels research and combustion research, you need to know a lot more about drug development.
Is this something that's more for government use or something that's more for commercial use, like in Boeing, Airbus, all
So
those?
we're what you would call dual use. So essentially you can use it either place. We can make different grades of the material. Of basically, if the DoD wants to use it for like super cool secret things that, who really knows what they're using it for, then usually they have more strict parameters to say, like, oh, we want really low this in it, and we want higher amounts of this in it. And so they'll specify it the way that they want it. So what I essentially sell to the DoD and what I sell to commercial aviation to just, burn in a 737 are similar but different molecules. So the core technology is all the same, but how you do your treatments on it, how you do your distillation cuts, how deep you hydrotreat it, all of these like parameters that you can tweak determine whether it's going to be suitable to be used for the DoD or suitable to use for your Airbuses and your Boeings and your Embraers and everything else. But the DoD more recently within the last 2 decades, favors heavily dual use technologies because if you only service the DoD, then you are dependent on them, right? If they don't order what you're making, you have no revenue and your company's going to go out of business. And the DoD inherently does not just continually buy things, right? They buy what they need, stockpile it, who knows how many rounds of artillery shells and ammunition and rockets and all these things that they keep stockpiles of. But until they burn through that stockpile, they're not going to order again. So if you're only servicing the DoD, it's a very risky place to be in because they are not a customer that just buys continuously. Like it's not like selling paper towels at Target, right? Everybody needs paper towels. And so your paper towels just continually sell. But if you only sell to the DoD, then it doesn't work out as well.
So it's something that you have to kind of think about, which is that you, at the end of the day, it's also a business. You have to be like remaining profitable while doing what you want to do and achieving what you want to achieve, basically.
Yeah, I mean the hard truth of the world is that it's all business, right? If it doesn't make dollars, then it doesn't make sense, right? Um, even in an academic institution, right? Let's say you're a professor. You go through and you do all your education, and you're like, it was my dream to be a professor. You make it, you're a professor. A professor spends the vast majority of their time writing research proposals to get money because somebody has to pay for this R&D, right? It's not free. You still have to pay grad student salaries, you have to pay technician salaries, you have to buy supplies. The space that you sit in is not free. The electricity, the rent on your building, like all of this stuff costs money. And in science, it costs a lot of money. Science is inherently a very expensive endeavor. Um, so even if you end up being a professor, which is kind of like the paragon of like independent, research what you want, do what you want, and all of this. Sure, you can research what you want and do what you want, so long as you can find money to do it. So at the end of the day, it still comes back to you're essentially running a business, right? Even a nonprofit still has a balance sheet. You still have to get money, pay for your people to do things, pay for supplies. So there's still a lot of cash management, there's still a lot of budgeting, there's still a lot of all these things. So no matter what you do, no matter how independent it may seem, you kind of have to keep those business principles in mind that you have to be able to get money, that you have to be able to fund it continuously, or you just go out of business.
I kind of have a two-part question. So the first part of this kind of connects to what you're saying. So being an entrepreneur, as you said, especially in the STEM industry, is very hard. So would you say that you have any regrets that have kind of surfaced throughout your experience? And then also separately, with related to what you're doing, has that been influenced by your parents? Because I know your dad was a fighter pilot and you do some work with fuel consumption for fighter pilots or whatever the military needs. So do you kind of have any influence of what you currently do? Not just what I asked about before about your plans in school, but now what you're actually doing is being the CEO and doing all the work with CleanJoule.
Well, I'm not a CEO, I'm a
Oh,
CTO,
sorry,
right? So
CTO. Sorry.
my CEO's name is Mukund Karanjakar, who you may see around at speaking at a number of these things. Usually I'm the one that, you know, gets to stay chained to the reactors and making sure the science works and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't do very much speaking engagements because it's really a lesser part of my job. More like speaking and engagements and going out and doing panels and all of that usually resides more with the CEO and business development, so your BD organization. On the operations and technologies sides, you usually don't see as much of those people because generally they're busy making sure that the company runs and the technology works. So the question of regrets, as far as the job descriptions that are around me, basically, I think that a lot of the advice on like jobs and what to do and where to go leaves out a giant part of just the aspects of life. Of I do not regret what I did or where I've gone and what I'm currently doing. But along the way, I've certainly seen easier ways that you could make a living and have a good life and, be independent without having to do an extra 12 years of school where you're paid essentially nothing, right? So I do not regret it because it is very interesting. I get to do interesting stuff all the time, right? I'm in what we do, I'm literally the world expert. No one else does what we do to the level that we do. And that's what a PhD really is, right? You get really, 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 really hyper focused on one just small aspect of science and you are supposed to become the world expert in that tiny little corner of science that you're working on. And so you get to do things that no one else has ever done. You get to solve problems that no one else has ever solved before. But that also makes it really hard, right? If it was easy, everybody would do it. So I don't regret that. And then the second part is the influence of my parents on what I do now. I would say there is less influence now on what I do than when I was a child. Again, going back more towards the business side of it. I mean, ultimately, you can try and pursue whatever you think is interesting if you think you can make a career out of it. Um, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the money or can find the money or find someone to pay for it, there's no way to do it. So a lot of my career is also just following the money and following the trends, right? Like, yeah, you might think that this one particular protein on one particular microbe is super interesting, and people spend their whole careers just trying to figure out how one little piece of one part of biology works. And that's totally valid. And they live their life just the same as you or I do doing something else. And then there's people that are more towards applied science, right? There's kind of a not a hard line, but a relatively clear line between basic science and applied science. Basic science is trying to figure out the whys. Like, why are we here? Why did this planet form? Why does gravity exist? Why can't we see anything smaller than the subatomic particles we can? Why? Applied science is trying to commercialize what you learn from figuring out why. So let's say you have a basic scientist that's researching cancer, and they find out, oh, there's this one protein that seems to go awry all the time in cancers. So like P53 is an example of that, which is a surveillance protein. But so P53 goes awry. So, oh, okay. So that's good basic science information. We know that now. So what can we do about it? So then it goes over to applied science, where an applied scientist is more thinking, okay, can I drug it? Can I make a drug against that protein? And then I could commercialize that into a drug I can sell to people and make a business and make money. So I to some degree in your career you have to follow the money, right? Because that's the point of the job, right? To pay you so that you can live at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the math is extremely simple. You need to go somewhere where you can trade time for money, and then you can trade the money to get the things you need to live.
And hopefully enjoy it at the same time too.
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, that would be great, but it's not necessarily reality. And also, I know you'll probably ask more questions around it later, but I think it's probably actually more important to figure out what kind of a life you want to have and what kind of life you want to live, more so than what you want to do. Because what kind of life you want to have is going to determine how far you can get in different fields. Like, in order to be like these super successful entrepreneurs that you read about from Silicon Valley and all of that stuff, your entire life has to be devoted to it. There's no one that's doing that that does 40 hours and goes home and doesn't think about it and just, goes on hikes and lives their life until 9 a.m. the next day when they show up at work, right? The highly success, if your goal is, I want to be someone that changes the world, or it doesn't even have to be that high. Just work for myself, be an entrepreneur, or solve the hard problems that no one's trying to solve for. It's You're gonna have to devote a significant fraction of your life to it that is not necessarily your 9 to 5. Whereas some people would much rather just work a 9 to 5 job and then do whatever they want with the rest of their life, right? Some people, hiking is the thing. That's what they live for. Or fly fishing or whatever. It can
Well,
be
there's a lot of
anything.
those things in Utah, so for
Yeah, I
you
mean,
it's pretty accessible.
a lot of outdoorsy stuff out here. So, but anything, right? Anything. Whatever you love to do. You might just love to watch Netflix, and that's totally fine. Like, do with your life what you want. But the field that you're going to go into, you have to be realistic about how much time and effort it's going to take you to get somewhere you want to be if you want to not be doing something else, right? Like, I have employees that Soccer is their life. They love soccer. They watch soccer, they coach soccer, they play soccer in intramural, right? Everything soccer. That's what they love. And it's really, really hard to make a living in soccer, right? You have to be a professional athlete, which is 0.0001, however low percentage that is, or you have to be paid basically nothing to be, an assistant coach or whatever, right? There's only so many coaching jobs on the planet, and it's not that many. So he works here doing science and STEM and all of that as just a job, right? He comes here 9 to 5 to make a paycheck so that he can go and do soccer. That is a completely different life than the upper echelons, like director plus levels, where they have to focus essentially their entire life on their job and their career and what they're trying to learn about. Like I always laugh. My wife, well, I'll be with my wife, and she'll be watching something on TV, and I'll be reading on my phone about new research articles and rockets and the new cancer therapies that are coming out and business article like I don't read for fun. I don't read novels. I'm not, a non-fiction or a fiction guy that does that for fun. I'm reading about science and my job and trying to keep up with what is happening in the world in STEM. So the vast majority of my life and time that is not devoted to my family is devoted to science. But that's really what it takes to be in the very high levels of science and just try to keep up on the information stream that is coming out like a fire hose, right? We're making discoveries at a faster rate than it's ever been done in history. And so just keeping on top of that, like what is everybody else doing? Never mind what you're doing, but what is everybody else doing is almost a full-time job to keep up on.
Okay, so now these are just kind of a few other questions I have. These are a few remaining questions. So, what do you have? Are there any misconceptions you would say about being an entrepreneur and working in STEM?
I mean, there's probably a massive number of of misconceptions.
Like ones that you have experienced physically that you some noted.
I would say a lot of people get into entrepreneurship or owning their own business or working for themselves or whatever you want to call it to have a quote unquote easier time. And I will say that it is not. It is a much harder time. You have to spend way more hours. You have to spend way more effort. You're going to think about it way more than if you worked at a Fortune 500 company. That you're just a cog in a machine and work your hours, go home, don't think about it. But you do have a boss, and they have a boss, and they have a boss, and they have a boss of, however many hierarchical layers there are within these companies versus working for yourself. Now, yeah, you get to be the one that's telling you what you need to do, but at the end of the day, much like we've talked about, you have to follow the money. Okay, well, there's probably projects that you don't want to do, but that's where the money is. And you need money to do the things you want to do, or to keep the lights on, or to pay the rent on the facility, or whatever. So you end up having to do it anyway. So it's not as free, I think, as much people would think. There's still so many obligations and restrictions and things you have to do to make the business successful.
So, what advice would you give to someone my age who wants to pursue becoming who wants to become an entrepreneur, who wants to pursue something with science, technology, something related to that, something related to what you do and what you have experience with?
Again, I mean, it comes back to kind of what we were saying before is decide what kind of a life you want to have first, because there are glass ceilings in science. I'll say there's less in engineering. So, engineering, you can get a bachelor's degree and end up being, lead engineers in places and working on really cool stuff. In like traditional sciences like chemistry, biology, physics, all these just like science things. if you get a bachelor's degree, it is difficult to move beyond being a technician. So technician level is basically hands. So you're not designing the experiments, you're not figuring out what to research, you're not doing any of the thought work. What you're doing is working for somebody else who is designing the experiments and figure out what direction to go. And you get a protocol and you pipette and do it and then hand the data back. So you're a very important part of science and what's going on, but you don't have as much control over direction or what you're going and understanding. So if you're going to do just regular science, you need to decide what kind of life you want to have, right? If it's not mostly science, if you don't think like science is cool and or engineering is cool, it can hold your attention, like you're like, oh, how does that work? Like take apart whatever a computer and you're like, what the heck is this? Is this a resistor? Is it a capacitor? Like anything like that. So I think it would be helpful to be somewhat intrinsically interested because if you want to do more of the thought work and less of just the hands-on work, then it's going to require a graduate degree. And that's not even really a master's. It's basically a PhD. So without a PhD, you have pretty hard glass ceilings that are hard to get over in science if you're on the science track, right? You could always be on the business track. Almost no large CEOs have PhDs. Now, my CEO does. He has a PhD in chemical engineering, so he went the wrong way. Should have just done business. But you can end up on the business side of these organizations very high with not very much education. But on the science side, you basically have to do what I did, and you end up with a 4-year bachelor's plus a 2-year master's plus a 4 to 7 year PhD to get to the point of making decisions in research programs.
So would you say that if you have children, if you don't, if you would like to, would you be okay with them, and would you encourage them to pursue similar paths that you did?
I would certainly be okay with it. I would also probably encourage it, but I'll say that my wife works in a completely different field from me, and we jockey back and forth with who's bringing home more or doing better or whatever, right? She's an interior designer, which is the antithesis of, STEM, but she makes a great career doing it. So again, it comes back to, for me, what kind of life did my kids want to live? If they're okay just, doing a 9 to 5 and they have a different passion, fishing, ribbon dancing, whatever, it doesn't matter, that you want to pour their life into, cosplaying, right? Some people make these crazy, crazy costumes that I can't even imagine by themselves, and that's your passion, then do what's going to make you happy. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got one life. And if you spend that one life working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks in an entrepreneurial STEM organization and you hate every second of it, like that's not going to be fun. And ultimately what you have is your one life, and work is 50% of your awake time, right? If you think about it, you're sleeping for 8 hours, you're working for 8 hours, and you're doing whatever for 8 hours. 50% of your life that you're not sleeping is going to be spent doing what you're doing for work. So try not to hate it. Um, but the other thing I'll say to that is if you don't know what you want to do, then you should figure it out either be by doing internships, finding people that do what you want to do, and talking to them, right? There's a lot of lower level positions in STEM and science and entrepreneurship, even that is not CEO, CTO, right? Heads of companies. There are scientists that have PhDs that are more educated and world experts in a lot of these things that never talk to anyone outside their organization. And if you were their neighbor or their nephew, or you go to church with them, or whatever, that you can find, there's a lot of people that you can approach that can give you a lot of good ideas on what you're thinking about doing, whether it's something you would maybe actually enjoy or not. So getting a real feel for what you're thinking of going into before you commit to doing college to do it is a great idea. And there's plenty of people that can give someone that's not in the industry at all great advice that you don't have to try and nail down a CEO that's heinously busy doing, God knows what to run a corporation. You can just talk to a scientist, right, at any of these corporations, and they can give you a great idea of what that job actually entails in a corporation. They might even be able to show you, right? Sometimes my employees will bring their kids in and be like, oh, this is what I do all day while you're at school. And we host high school students and college teachers and all these things to be like, look, this is what we do every day. This is what you're really looking at. So there's certainly a lot of ways that you can figure out what you want to do that are relatively easy, and you can access people that have the time to say. So again, I guess I'm the long-winded answer guy, but I'll say I would not necessarily encourage or discourage my children from pursuing STEM. It really depends on what their interests are. And particularly as they're growing up, they shift, right? They might want to be a ballerina, and that's totally cool. But I will say that you should also always have a backup plan for not achieving the 0.1% top, right? If your life goal is to be a professional athlete of any kind, a ballerina, a basketball player, a race car driver, like anything, only the top 0.01 or less percent of people do that. If you are not in that group, you make zero money, right? People's dream to be actors. If you do not get to the point where you are a named person on a movie poster, you're not making buku bucks being an actor, right? The options are feast or famine. There's not much of a middle ground. Whereas in engineering, for example, the current, at least as of a couple of years ago, the highest paid bachelor degree was chemical engineering. So you get a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. As long as you can show up to a workplace for 8 hours, you will have a decent life. You will get paid a decent amount of money. You will be able to have, a middle class, decent life. You'll get a retirement. Like everything will be fine and work out. But if you get a degree in acting, you have to make it or you're going to starve or
So it's like
switch,
putting it
right?
all on the line.
Yes, you're putting it all on the line. And that's not my uh forte. I've never done all in of like no backdrop. I'm also not a big gambler, but coming from a scientist that works with things that can blow up at any point and cause massive amounts of damage, potentially kill people, right? We don't take risks super hard on that, and so that bleeds into my personal life too. I'm not a huge risk taker. um so for me, I would always advise my children to, you can shoot for the stars in anything you want. And if you want to be an actor, go try and be an actor. But have a backup that if you can't be the 0.01% and make it all the way, right? There's only one LeBron James. Everybody can't be LeBron James, right? But if you're not going to make it to being LeBron James, and that's hard to tell when you're a teenager and you're forced to pick, like, what are you going to go to college for? Like, you got to pick right now.
Yeah,
So
it's the big
it's
question.
it's difficult, but I would pick something that has a fallback. And if you don't want to pick something that has a fallback, let's say you want to be an actor or the next great painter, right? You just love realism painting and you want to be the next great painter. That's all fine. But if you're not going to be able to make that, what are you going to do to survive? And so picking something that you like and find interesting but that has, for example, a very low unemployment rate post bachelor's degree is a good hedge that says, maybe I'm burned out from college, right? College can be hard. So you get to the end of the degree, right? You're not done. You're just starting your career. And so then you walk into the next thing that's even worse. So there's no breather time. Sure, you can take a gap year or whatever, but if you're not going to make it, then what? And it's hard to say, right? For all you know, how much have you tried painting, right? For all you know, you're an amazing painter and you could be the next Picasso. But if that doesn't work out, now what? So I advise hedging your bets, I guess, is the moral of that.
Okay. So this has all been really interesting. I think it was really interesting interviewing you, hearing about your dad in aerospace engineering. That is what I have thought about wanting to do when I'm older. Talking about building computers. I actually built my own computer. So it's just been really interesting to hear from you. And I was also a Boy Scout for a while. So yeah, that's all the questions I have. If you have any questions for me, then you can ask away. But if not, we can wrap up here.
What are you thinking about doing? What are your options like optioning out? What's your most interesting and your maybe not as interesting but still might do it?
So I think for me right now, astrophysics, aerospace engineering, anything around physics, and that has been my main interest for a while. I've never been too much of a biology person. I think chemistry, after a year of chemistry, it's been interesting. I think I can see myself doing something related to that. But then the bigger picture for me would be something where I'm doing something with entrepreneurship, something where I'm branching out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good plan. I will say the path to the most amount of freedom, even though it's a different kind of freedom, and potentially higher pay is really entrepreneurship of anything, right? If you're good at entrepreneurship, you can make just as much money designing the next microchips as starting a lawn care business, as
Making computer
washing
chargers
windows.
or yeah.
Yeah, it can be anything, right? It's weird to think about, but the next time you're driving down any street, anywhere, just look at every business that's lining the street. There's stuff for nails and pet grooming and restaurants. And every one of these businesses is owned by someone that started out on an entrepreneurial journey. It might not be now, right? McDonald's is a giant multinational conglomerate, but it was started by one dude as his entrepreneurial vision. So I would say biasing towards entrepreneurship, no matter what you do, underwater basket weaving or physics, is probably going to get you to higher echelons than is available if you don't go entrepreneurial.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great. It was great to talk to you, Andrew.
Thank you.